A very good evening, friends. My name is Dhanunjay Reddy, and you know that I am going to take the classes of political science and international relations for UPSC Civil Services students, the optional of political science and international relations. So today we are going to discuss about one more school in international relations, and that school is the Neo-Realist School. So before going into that, let me tell you what is my way of going for this today's class. I will recap whatever we have read so far so that we can have a structural analysis and we can link what we are telling very clearly. So I'll get go with a recap and then enter into the so-called neo-realist aspect of international relations. And as itself this one itself shows that neo-realist school. There are two schools in neorealism. One is of Kenneth Walls and another one is of John Meyer Schemer. This is a book of Kenneth Walls, Theory of International Politics, and then this is a book of John Meyer Schemer, the book of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So we are going to discuss about these two things today because they form a component of neo-realism, and that is the topic that we are going to discuss today, and we will also know how these two persons differ in their analysis. So this is what we are going to discuss today, and before going into that discussion, let us recall the last lectures that we have done so far. See, we in the first class we discussed how the discipline of international politics or international relations has evolved. We have heard that international politics or international relations is the newest discipline in youngest discipline youngest discipline in political science. And we know why that is youngest discipline because it has started only after 1919, the First World War. So this was how the international politics has evolved, and it has, in order to understand that, we went back until 1648, where there has been a treaty known as the Treaty of Westphalia, because we have done this to understand the so-called the New World Order. And there was also some important questions which was asked in the previous UPSC question paper about the Treaty of Westphalia and what is Westphalian World Order. We have seen what are the features in Westphalian World Order, that is from 1648 to 1919, and how the world structure was present at that point of time. Then we came to the discussion of the New World Order. So, in order to understand this New World Order, we went to the World Order and we understood what are the features of the Old World Order, and why the so-called Woodrow Wilson gave the concept of the New World Order. And then from this New World Order, there is the first school of international politics or international relations, and that is the liberal school of international politics or international relations, which was evolved in 1919. From 1919, this is the first school in international relations with the idea of the so-called Woodrow Wilson. This school was emerged. However, the failures of the international liberal school in guessing the occurrence of the Second World War made critics to come out with a new world order or new school of international relations, and that is the realist school of international relations. We discussed in the realist school the emergence of realist school, who are the proponents of the realist school, and why realist school has come into picture in the last class. If you have any questions about that, you can just go to the previous class. You can have a look and then you can join here. So that is a realist school of international relations. In the international relations, we said that we discussed about a person called Hans J. Morgenthau, who in the year 1949 has come out with a book called Politics Among Nations. In his book, he has written 6 principles guiding the international politics, and he claimed that it is a very scientific approach. It is not an utopian approach which the New World Order or liberal schools have proposed. He said that it is a realist school, and hence this has to be given consideration. In the end of that discussion, we have said, or we talked about the criticisms of realist school. There were 3 criticisms. Obviously, one is from the liberal school, who has criticized the realists, and then one is from the feminist schools, who has criticized the realists because they have neglected ethics in international politics. And the major criticism has come from one man called Kenneth Walls. Kenneth Walls belongs to the so-called neo-realist. We also discussed what Kenneth Walls said. Kenneth Walls said that though Morgenthau has stated that his approach is scientific approach, but it is not scientific in such a way, in any way. So he said that What Morgenthau said is just a static part. It is not scientific. It is rhetoric. So we have to give a scientific analysis for realism. From that point of view, Kenneth Walls started a new school of international politics in realism, and that is called the neo-realist school. This is how the neo-realist school has emerged, and this is what we discussed so far. So today, let us go into the first topic, the neo-realism. What is this neo-realism? We will look at the evolution of how it has evolved. We have seen that classical realists or those persons, E.H. Carr and Morgenthau. We just discussed about Morgenthau, and E.H. Carr is the first realist school philosopher who said that the liberal schools are utopians and they failed to understand the Second World War reasons. So, in his 20 years of crisis book, he has written a book called 20-Year Crisis. In this, he has observed how the realists or the liberals failed between 1919 and 1939. These are the 20 years on which he observed, and he has written a book. And he observed this thing, and they said that liberal school failed to guess the Second World War. As a result, they were utopians. So E.H. Carr was the first person in realism, and then it was followed by the father of realism called Hans J. Morgenthau. And then, as a criticism to Hans J. Morgenthau, a new school has emerged, and that is called neo-realist school. In this neo-realism, the main propounder of neo-realism, as we have seen, is Kenneth Walls. So today we are going to discuss about the so-called Kenneth Walls, and there is one more neo-realist called John Miyashima. So John Miyashima is one more neo-realist. We will look at what is the difference between Kenneth Walls' theories and John Miyashima's. But to give a brief understanding here itself, Kenneth Walls, he has written a book known as Theory of International Politics that we have seen in the first slide in the year 1979. 1979 in world history is during the time of Cold War. Between 1969 and 1979, there is one phase in Cold War called the detente period. Detente period where USA and USSR has halted their Cold War. So, by observing those circumstances, this man has written the book called Theory of International Politics in 1979, and then he has given a concept called defensive realism. And then there was one more person called John Mearsheimer. This man has written a book known as The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001. In his book, he explained his philosophy of offensive realism. We will look at what is defensive realism and what is offensive realism, which is very important from the perspective of Union Public Service Commission. But it is also important to understand the realist school per se from offensive realist perspective also. And then, as it is 2001, John Mearsheimer belongs to the post-Cold War. Unlike this man who was a Cold War theorist, he was post-Cold War theorist. And then we have also seen that neo-realism has emerged with only one thing, that is we have to give a scientific analysis of international relations. Utopian concepts don't work in international relations. Let us give scientific analysis. And it was in the year 1950s and 1949 in social sciences a new discipline called behavioral revolution has started. Behavioral revolution has said or has given a new concept of scientific analysis of all the sciences. So the scientific revolution has started with this school called behavioral revolutionarism, and the neo-realists used this concept to understand the international politics. So this is a brief idea about evolution of neo-realism. Now, as we are discussing realism, we have so far seen classical realism or the realism or the old realism, and we are discussing about neo-realism. Now, before that, we have to understand what is the difference between the classical realism and the neo-realism as such. Classical means old. Neo means contemporary. So classical means old, neo-realism means contemporary realism. And this classical realism was given by E.H. Carr, we discussed, and then there was this man called Hans J. Morgenthau. Neo-realism, as we have seen, there was two persons. One is Kenneth Walls, and the other person is John Mearsheimer. So these are the proponents. And then we have seen what are the similarities. See, neoliberalism, neo and classical realism, neo-realism, they don't differ in their philosophy of what constitutes the international politics. They agree that international politics is a politics for struggle. Both agree. That is realist itself. As they are realists, they agree that international politics is politics of struggle for power. So there is no difference up to that level. But the difference emerges only in their method or the basis on which they arrive at the conclusion that struggle exists in the world. So based on the method that they adapted, this realist school was classified as classical and neo. Let us look at what is the method that classical realists applied and neo realists applied as such. For classical realists, they have given the concept of actor level analysis. What is this actor level analysis? In the last class itself, we discussed that international relations is struggle for power because they have propounded the human nature. Through human nature, they said that international relations is anarchic. So, human, the person who is at the helm of affairs, is responsible for all these things. So, in the state, say for example, if Xi Jinping is at the head of China, he was responsible for creating trouble. If it was Nehru who is at the helm of affairs, then he is responsible for his conduct of foreign policy. So, what they say is it is the human nature, or it is the actor level analysis. Who is the actor? The person who is at the helm of affairs is going to decide the foreign policy. So this is what the classical realists say, and hence the international politics as such is anarchic because of the human nature. So they considered human nature is responsible for the state of affairs in international politics. That is what they said. So that is what they said. And now, whereas the neo-realists, they said that it is not the human nature, rather it is the structure in the system. So you are confusing. See, what neo-realist said is you are confusing with the personality of the person, and then you are coming to the conclusion that international politics is played in this way. No, you cannot conclude this. The reason is, I'll tell you the reason. But what they say is, don't think that it is the actor who is playing, but the structure itself, the structure in the international world order itself is causing problem to is shaping the international politics. Struggle for power is because of the structure, not because of the human nature. So this is the method that they adapted. So they have similarities up to the point that they agree, yes, international politics is struggle for power, but they differ only here on their method. One is classical realists say actor is responsible, whereas neo realists say structure is responsible. That is the difference. Up to this point, I think you are very clear. This is what I wanted to say. That is the first difference. And now we will go into further. Now see, what is the method? I said they differ in the method that they adapted, right? What is that method? What is the method that they adapted? See, classical realists applied the method of actor level analysis. We discussed what is an actor, person at the helm of affairs. The person who is at the helm of affairs is responsible for the international politics to be in a very anarchical position. That is a claim of classical realists. However, realists said we cannot build any scientific theory on the basis of human nature. Human nature is a very dynamic concept. You cannot build a scientific theory based on human nature because human nature as such doesn't have any scientific view. Today my nature will be one thing and tomorrow by looking at the circumstances my nature changes. So there is no scientific proposal that okay this fellow behaves in this way at all times. So this is what the claim is. So human nature is unpredictable. You cannot predict the human nature. So as you cannot predict, there cannot be any scientific view. When there is no scientific view, how can you give it to international relations? So human nature as such is unpredictable. And then they say, we cannot make generalizations or theories based on the human nature. Today I will be behaving in one way, tomorrow my nature will behave another way. Based on that differences, how are you going to generalize? And how are you going to generalize my human nature to the entire globe? That is wrong. So they say, at max, you cannot go for generalization theories based on human nature. What is generalization theories? The theories which can be applicable everywhere. Generally, we can apply, but you cannot apply here. The reason being, human nature is very dynamic, it is unpredictable, and it is scientifically we cannot have any scientific view of human nature. So we have to go beyond human nature and understand how the structure is present. This is what these people claim. So this is the next thing that I said. So the method adapted itself is different. Now, how this structural analysis? Now we said that structural analysis, neo-realists go for structural analysis. How they go for this? Beyond human nature they go. What they say is how to establish realist view through scientific basis. How they have established? We look at this through the study of the structure of international politics. By studying the structure, not by studying the human nature, but by studying the entire structure itself, they said that human nature, they said that international politics is anarchical. And how they have evolved to that point? By using the so-called behavior revolution that we discussed so far. Behavioral revolution was a concept which was given in social sciences to understand any science in a very systematic way. So it evolved after the Second World War. And then it was a social science. And then these persons, the neo-realists, have brought this thing called behavior revolution. And then they applied the same principles to the so-called international politics. In behavior revolution, there is one concept called systems approach. In comparative politics, the first chapter in paper 2, we are going to study the systems approach. But for now, let us remember system approach. Behavioral theories say every system will have two things. One is elements operating the system. There will be certain elements or units who are participating in the system, and then there will be constant interaction of these elements for some purpose. So David Easton has given this model. Okay, this is the system, political system or whatever the system is. You will have inputs and then you will have the political system and then there will be outputs. This is inputs and this is outputs. So this is a system how David Easton used the behavioral revolution, and he said, so every system has this thing called elements and there will be interaction. So this we have to remember. Behavioral revolution says that system operates in two ways. Either it should have one, elements in it or the units in it, and two, they have to be constantly interacting with a sustained pattern. Patterned interaction exists. Why they interact? In order to achieve some goal. So this was the theory which was proposed by behavior revolutionaries. And then neo-realists applied the same principle to international politics, and they said that yes, systems approach is based on the concept of system, and we are going to apply the same thing in international politics. How they apply? International system also has two things, that is elements and their interaction. What are the elements here? The elements are sovereign states. States are the elements who are going to interact. And why they are interacting? With a common purpose. What is that purpose? We will see. What is that purpose? Their purpose was security maximization. So they are constantly interacting in this system. So the first thing what structural realists say is international relations can be studied in a systematic way in the form of system. In the system we have units called sovereign states, and sovereign states always interact with each other in the form of billiard balls. Just like the billiard ball game where each ball represents one state and they will be constantly interacting to achieve one goal. So this is what the international system is composed of. As the states are sovereign, sovereignty means internally they are sovereign and externally they are sovereign, which means there is no authority over or above the state. There is no authority over or above the states. States are the ultimate authorities. So states are the ultimate authorities. externally or internally. There is no common authority which can guide, okay, states, you have to behave in this way. So, sovereign states are the players. As the states are sovereign, there is no common authority at the top like United Nations Organization or League of Nations to determine this is the law and you have to behave in this way. There is no common authority because states are supreme. Every state is supreme. Britain is supreme, France is supreme, Spain is supreme, Russia is supreme, Russia is supreme. So there is no common authority. So this is how the international order is. And then they say, as there is no common authority, every state will be behaving on themselves. So anarchy is the organizing principle. Anarchy here means there is no common authority. So every state will be behaving in their own pattern. It is just like realists. Neo-realists also said the same thing up to here. And then what they said, as there is anarchy, every state has to go for self-help for survival. We do not know which state attacks on other state at what point of time. So we have to depend on ourselves for survival. That is what they said. Then in the system, there is always continuous struggle for power. There is always continuous struggle for power. Because it is only through power you can survive. So if France is increasing its power, Russia will be increasing its power. If Russia is increasing its power, Britain will be increasing its power. So continuous struggle for power exists. After that, every state, irrespective of your state is small or your state is big, they have only one function in the foreign policy or one function in the international relations. That is, their function is to attract power. So there is no functional differentiation among the states in international politics. Every state has the same function, no functional differentiation in international politics. If you look at the national politics, then there exists functional differentiation. Say, for example, if it is India, in India, domestic politics has functional differentiation. Legislature has the function of doing laws or enacting laws. Executive have implementing function. Judiciary has reviewing function. So domestically, functional differentiation exists. But internationally, there is no functional differentiation. Every state finally has only one function, that is acquisition of power. That is a function. So irrespective of whether your state may be small or whether your state may be big, so there is no much difference. If there is one difference in international politics, that difference exists only in the capacity of the states. Some may have large capacity like USA, some may have very least capacity to influence international politics. They differ only in capacity, not in the functions, right? Their function ultimately is to maximize power. Why power? Again, for self-help. As a result, there is continuous struggle for power. There exists security dilemma in the structure. Right? This is how neo-realists said. Security dilemma is because of this. And through this analysis, they have come to this point. What they said, international system has certain elements. They didn't go on human nature. They said that there are certain sovereign states. Every state will be interacting like a billiard ball model. In billiard ball model, every state will be interacting. There is no common authority because the states are sovereign. As a result, anarchy is the organizing principle. When organizing principle is anarchy, state depend on self-help for survival. It cannot depend on others to help us because other state might give hand at any point of time. So self-help for survival is the most important thing. As they will be struggling for self-help or increasing their power, there will be continuous struggle for power after power, right? And every state has this function only. There is no functional differentiation. As a result, security dilemma exists in the international politics. So this is what structural realists came to the point. In realism, or classical realism, they said that human nature is responsible for the security dilemma, but this person, they said that it is not, it is the structure itself is creating security dilemma. That is the difference that we have to understand between these things. So these are the features of structural realism. And then we will be going to the next point. How to address this structural realism? How to address this, security dilemma. We just have seen that security dilemma exists and how to address this. How the states deal with security dilemma is the question now. How? Through power acquisition. So this is a common answer. I have to have power to ensure my security and I can overcome my security dilemma. But the question, actual question rises here. How much power is sufficient for you? How much power is enough for you is the question. Based on this question, there are two answers. One is minimum power and another one is maximum power. What is this minimum power? Minimum power is I should have at least a minimum power to counter the other state or to balance the other state, right? If other state is, say for example, China is increasing its power, India should have minimum power to counter that. So that is minimum power. That is balancing power. I should have minimum to balance or to counter. I should have minimum power, that is balancing power. What is this maximum power? Maximum power is dominating power. If my power is very huge, so that I can go and dominate on the other person, and I can have hegemony over other person. This maximum power is called preponderance power. Preponderance. Preponderance power or hegemonic power. I should have such power that other person should not dare even to attack. That is called preponderance power. Power should be to that maximum that deterrence should create by looking at the power itself. So this is maximum power. So power as such, how much power is enough? Is either you should have minimum power or maximum power. What is that minimum power? Minimum power to balance the other state, that we call it as balancing power, and maximum power is preponderance power or hegemony power. I have to have my preponderance over other state. That is preponderance power, hegemony power. So based on these two differences, in neorealism, we have two more schools. One is defensive realism and another one is offensive realism. That is what we have seen in the first slide. Defensive realism of Kenneth Waltz, offensive realism of John Mearsheimer. Now we will look at in depth of each and everything. Right, this is what I said. Power. There are two powers, two answers exist. How much power? Defensive power by Kenneth Waltz, and then there is balancing of power. That is, what is this defensive realism? We should have minimum power to balance or to counter the other state. Other one is offensive realism. Offensive realism means it should have maximum power, hegemonic power or preponderance power, so that I can go and offend the other person. Now we will see the differences between the defensive realism and the offensive realism. And before going into that, this is how the schools were classified. One I said classical realism. The second one is the neorealism. In neorealism, we have these two schools, that is defensive and offensive. I think so far it is very clear. Let's move to next slide. Defensive realism by Kenneth Waltz. Now what is this defensive realism? We are going to see what is this defensive realism of Kenneth Waltz. This was propounded by the so-called Kenneth Waltz. As we have seen, international politics is in a state of anarchy. However, every state is a rational actor. What do you mean by rational actor? Every state knows what is best for them. So every state is well aware what is best interest for them, what makes the best for the state. So they are rational actors. So we are discussing international politics. Every state has rational actors. There are no irrational actors. So they say, yes, every state is a rational actor. So every state see survival as they are rational. So what is the best interest? Survival. Next, as the interest is survival, in the state of anarchy, survival of state depends on self-help, right? So you have to survive means you have to depend on self-help. So you should have power. This is what we discussed so far. And then how much power is required? Defensive realism say, if there is a question on defensive realism, you have to write in this way. International politics is in the state of anarchy. States are rational actors, and they know what is in the best interest of them. The best interest for any state is survival of the state. In order to survive, they have to depend on self-help, and in order to have self-help, they should maximize their power. They should have power. Now the question is how much power they should want. The power as per defensive realism is, according to Kenneth Waltz, states are security maximizers. We have just seen what is there for survival, right? Survival, that is security is their goal. So states are security maximizers as per Kenneth Waltz, right? Security maximizers. It means the primary goal of the state is security and not domination. These are the important features of defensive realism. Security states are security maximizers. State seeks for security and not domination. And then states acquire power. How much power? Just to secure or to defend themselves, not to go and attack. Right? And then, so states are security maximizers. This is again I said because this is very important topic. Power that is enough for their security, not limitless power. Don't go for limitless power. Power can be of two ways. One is minimum power, maximum power. Don't concentrate on maximum power. Go for minimum power, that is which can secure your national interest. Thus, security and not power is the end. So you should have minimum power to have your ultimate objective of security. So security is the ultimate objective of any state. Power is only the means, but the end is security. Right? So defensive really says power is means, security is an end. Power is not an end in itself. Right? Let us remember this. While discussing Morgenthau, we said dual nature of power. Power is both means and ends. Morgenthau said power is means for power is the means and power is the end. But here, defensive really says no. Power is just a means to acquire the objective of security of the nation. That is, security is the end here. So these two people differ here again. Hence, so what is the conclusion? It is not limitless power. How much power you should have? Minimum power to deter the other person. What is deterrence? Creating fear in the other person. Creating a fear that we should not go and attack on the other person. So you should have minimum power so that you can counter the other person. This should be the structure of power. If there is this amount of power for A, state B should have only this power to counter each and everyone's power. So that should be the goal of international politics. That is what defensive realism by Kenneth Walsh says. These are the features. One is security maximization, very important. Security and not domination is the goal. And then states acquire power for their own security or defense, not for attack. So states are security maximizers. Power is enough for their security and not limitless power. And then security and not power is an end. Thus power is means only. Security is an end in itself. Right? Power, Morgenthau says power is a means as well as ends. But Kenneth Walsh says power is the means, security is the end goal of the states. Now, again, there are certain features. Defensive realism, again, we are discussing the same thing. For security, that much power is enough, which maintains the equilibrium. This is what we said, right? You should have minimum power to maintain the equilibrium. According to Walsh, states should not seek or try to have hegemonic power or preponderance power. There will be power. I said, you just have an idea of this. You should keep in mind this thing always. Power has minimum power and maximum power. Maximum power is hegemonic power. We call it as preponderant power. Minimum power is balancing power. So you keep this in mind, right? Kenneth Walsh says, okay, state should have minimum power or balancing power. They should not go for maximum power. So if they go for hegemonic power, what Kenneth Walsh says, it is counterproductive to the states. Why it is counterproductive? It leads to counter coalitions. Say for example, if China is trying to have this hegemonic power, then automatically other states surrounding the China will form a coalition and then they will counter you. If they are countering you, again you will come to the first point of security dilemma, insecurity feeling. So you should have minimum power to equilibrium so that counterproductive, there will not be any counterproductive, and then there will not be any counter coalition against you. If you are maximizing your power, then other states form coalitions and then they come and attack you. Again, your objective is failed. Your state security is lost. So Kenneth Walsh says, just maintain that power which attains equilibrium, not go for hegemonic power. This is the first most important difference between offensive realist and defensive realist. You go for defensive purpose only, not for offensive purpose. As the name itself says, this is defensive realism. So according to Kenneth Walsh, what are the features that we discussed? State seeks security seeks to achieve the balance. Hence, attempting hegemony is counterproductive. So counter coalitions will be formed, and then you will come to the first point of insecurity dilemma. Right? This is how defensive realists say their concept. So remember this. What I said, you have to remember the concept of this always. Here is how the classification is done. You remember this because we are going to use the same logic again in offensive realists also. Next, moving to next slide. So why Kenneth Waltz said this? You should have equilibrium power, because as I said, Kenneth Waltz has written his book in the time of 1979, right? By observing the so-called between the phases of 1969 and 1979, though this was a Cold War period, there was in one phase in Cold War called detente phase. What is this detente? Detente means there was no struggle directly between USA and USSR. They have halted the war for 10 years. That phase is called phase of detente. In Cold War, we will be discussing this phase in detail. But for now, remember that between 69 and 79, the period between 69 and 79 is phase of detente during the Cold War. As Kenneth Waltz is a Cold War realist, at the time of Cold War, he has seen this detente. As a result, he has also seen that USA and USSR entering into cooperation and they are not fighting each other. What are during this phase? USA and USSR entered into some cooperative agreements such as Non-Proliferation Treaty. They entered into one treaty, and then there is one more treaty called SALT, which means Strategic Arms Limitation Control. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. By looking at these treaties, Kenneth Waltz has thought that okay, Cold War has come to an end because USA and USSR has equal powers. So as a result, they are entering into cooperative agreements now. The result is NPT as well as SALT. So these are the cooperative agreements because he thought that USA and USSR has reached equilibrium position in their powers. So what he said, nations acquire power to the extent that they think is sufficient for their security. So this is the context on which he has given that power is you should have minimum power or the power to balance or offset your opponent. Right, gentlemen? So I think you are very clear up to this point. This is what defensive realism is all about. The context is this one. And what he has proposed, we have seen minimum power. Don't go for hegemonic power. He again orders, don't go for hegemonic power. If you are going for hegemonic power, then counter alliances or counter coalitions are going to be formed, and then they are going to wage war on your country again. So counterproductive. Hegemonic power will be counterproductive. So don't go for counterproduction. I think up to this point, everyone is clear of their mark, right? Now we will go to next school, and that school is offensive realism. The proponent of offensive realism is John Mearsheimer. Now, I said that he has, in the year 2001, he has written a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. As he was the 21st century scholar, he has seen the post-Cold War, the phase of post-Cold War. Unlike Kenneth Waltz, who was a Cold War theorist, this man was post-Cold War realist. Now, he has written a book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001. And why he has written a book? What is the context? The context is, after 2001, he has seen the emergence of China. USSR has declined. USSR was disintegrated in 1990s. But from 1990s to 2000, China was a mere power, not a big power. But after 2001, he has seen that China is increasing its military expenditure, increasing its economic expenditure. It is going and making treaties with all the neighbors. Then he has seen, so based on this, he has thought, okay, the rise of China is how China is rising, and is USA should look at how should USA look at China's rise? How should USA look at the rise of China? Because after 2001, China is being very, very assertive in its tone. It is increasing its power, military power, and then how US should go to China. Is China seeking balance or is it seeking hegemony? Is China seeking balance? Kenneth Waltz says yes, China is seeking balance. It is not going for hegemony in Kenneth Waltz's view. He said that Kenneth Waltz, as he is defensive release, he says China's actions are an attempt to increase its security and not to wage war on USA or to counter USA. So China is seeking its security. This is Kenneth Walls' proposal and said USA need not to worry as long as there is a balance between the power of USA and China. So this is how Kenneth Walls was thinking. Then this man said, by looking at the assertiveness of China, this man has said, hello gentlemen, Kenneth Walls, please wait. Look at the real things that is happening in China. They are increasing military power. They are increasing their economic power. So there is something beyond security. What are the intentions? There is some intention behind China, which is why it is going for maximum its power. So this man said in his book, that is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. He has written in his book that China's goal is beyond its security, as was thought by Kenneth Walls. Kenneth Walls simply said that China's intention is only security, but China's intention is beyond its security. What is that intention? We will see. Mearsheimer viewed that China is not looking for balance. Like Germany under Adolf Hitler and like France under Napoleon, China is seeking for hegemony. This is very, very important. Like Germany under Adolf Hitler, like France under Napoleon, China is also seeking for hegemony. It wants to have its hegemonic power and replace USA in its hegemony or dominance. So it is not looking for just balance, it is going for hegemonic power. Remember that table that I said, right? Hegemonic power. Now China's actions are not defensive as was thought by Kenneth Walls, rather they are offensive. Right? And then he said, why he said this? Nations are not security maximizers. Who said this? Security maximizers. Kenneth Walls said that nations are security maximizers. But Mearsheimer says nations are not security maximizers, they are power maximizers. They go on enhancing their power. They don't look for security. Yes, security might be one option. Even after having that power to counter security or to defend their security, they still go for expanding their power. So nations are not security maximizers, they are power mongers, they are power maximizers. So that was the concept of John Mearsheimer. Right? So he gave this in offensive realism. Based on this context, so this was a context. Let us be clear on the context of this man and this man, right? If you understand the context, you can understand the theory as such. Now, what are the key ideas in offensive realism? If you look at the key ideas, offensive realism is given by John Mearsheimer in his book The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001. Right? It is a school of neo-realism, as we know, and that is structural realism, because they both agree that he shares certain basic assumptions of Kenneth Walls, right? What are those assumptions? As it is neo-realist school, there are certain basic assumptions which Kenneth Walls says right and John Mearsheimer agrees with that. What is that? Anarchy is the organizing principle of international politics. State seeks for survival because states are rational actors. State seeks for survival. So this is what Kenneth Walls said, and this man agrees. Okay, states are rational actors and they seek for survival. That is right. However, the difference between Kenneth Walls and Mearsheimer is that state seeks for hegemonic power and not balancing power. This is what the difference is between Kenneth Walls and between John Mearsheimer. This is the difference between offensive realism and defensive realism. This is the starting point of difference. And he says that state wants to establish preponderance power, not just balancing power. So this is what this man said. Now, how Mearsheimer proves his point? How he proves, yes, states were going for maximizing their power, not security maximizers. How he is going to prove his point is correct, and Kenneth Walls has mistakenly thought that states are security maximizers. How he proves? He proves through two evidences. One is empirical evidence, that is historical evidence, and one is logical reasoning. What he says, empirically, if you look at the history, France under Napoleon, Germany under Hitler are best examples to say that states have offensive ambitions. Not every state will be balancing. Some states will be having offensive ambitions also. And it is very clear in the history. That is, under Napoleon, France went on to maximize its power. Under Hitler, Hitler went to maximize the power of Germany. This shows that states have offensive ambitions also. So they are power maximizers, not just security maximizers. Hence, they say power is the goal or the means, and power is the end of the stage. He agrees to this point. John Mearsheimer agrees to this point called power is the means and power is the end, because power maximizes. Power maximization is the ultimate goal, not security maximization, as was said by Kenneth Walls. Here comes Morgenthau, like Mearsheimer, also believes that. So Morgenthau and Mearsheimer agrees to this point that power is not only the means but an end in itself. So this was the convergence point between Morgenthau and Mearsheimer, right? Now, this is the empirical evidence. From history, he has given one evidence. So to prove his point as correct. And now, what is that second evidence to prove his point correct? The second evidence is logical reasoning. What is that logical reasoning? States' international politics is very anarchical. States are rational. State seeks for survival. In order to survive, they have power, and that is offensive power. Because how can you assume that certain state is thinking in this way? So states cannot be sure of what assumptions other states are having. How can USA or Kenneth Walls be so sure that China's assumption is only for balancing of power? You cannot be sure of what other person is thinking or what other state is thinking. How you clearly judge that this person is thinking only or assuming this only up to this level, right? It depends upon person to person and state to state. So he says that Kenneth Walls, what you said is wrong because you cannot assume what other states are thinking of. This is a basic reason, basic logic on which you say that you should have maximum power. If you are minimizing your power, thinking or assuming that other state is not expanding its power, then you are logically wrong. Right? This is through these points, he says that states have the ambition of power maximization, not security maximization. And he proves his point correct, right? Let's see what are the ideas in offensive realism, key ideas in offensive realism. We are continuing these key ideas, right? We have seen the first 5 ideas, and then we are continuing with the 6th idea here. What is the 6th idea? States can never be sure of the intentions of other states. Yes, it is always better to have preponderance. We should have hegemonic power or preponderance power, because we cannot be sure at what time the other state is going to act in what way. So states seek for hegemony, right? Because these persons believe offense is the best defense. And history clearly showed that those who attacked first had advantage. So offense is the best defense. Don't defend yourself. Have such power that if someone is trying to offend you, you go and offend in the first way. So offense is the best defense. So history shows that those who attacks first has better advantage. So this is the point of offensive realism. So these are the key ideas which defensive realists say. One idea is they have written a book called Great Power Politics, and then it is similar to neo-realism or structural realism. He shares certain assumptions which are familiar to Kenneth Walls also, and they do agree up to that point of power, and they only differ on which type of power they should have, whether it should be minimum power or maximum power. Kenneth Walls says that it should have balancing power and not maximize hegemonic power. This man says state has to go for hegemonic power in order to deter, or preponderant power in order to deter the other person from attacking you. So this is the basic difference between offensive realism and defensive realism. I think it is very clear, right? Now, see, there is one more question which was raised by Kenneth Walls. If states are going for hegemonic power, they are going to have counterproductive. They are going to be counterproductive, right? We have seen counterproductive. Kenneth Walls clearly said that states should not go for maximizing their power, because if the states are going to maximize their power, other states are going to form coalitions, counter coalitions to that state, and then they are going to wage a war. This is counterproductive for the state which is going for hegemony. This is what Kenneth Walls said. But how Mearsheimer proves that point wrong? Because he said that you go for hegemony. If you go for hegemony, then how can you overcome this point? Mearsheimer says, yes. Whether hegemony is counterproductive as said by Walls, Mearsheimer says, no, it is not counterproductive. Why? In international relations, states do not always go for coalitions or forming coalitions or counter coalitions or balancing. No, states never go for that. Yes, state might go, but there is also a possibility that state might not go for coalitions. For example, if China is expanding its power, hegemonic power, how can you think that USA is going to form coalitions with other states such as Pakistan, Philippines, the neighboring states of China such as Pakistan, Philippines, Brunei, whatever the states are surrounding? How you thought that every state is going to form alliance with USA and counter China? So this is not going to happen. What he said is, in international relations, states always do not go for forming counter alliances because there is one concept called bandwagoning rather than balancing. He has said this point that states go for bandwagoning. They always do not go for balancing. As China is rising, USA should come and balance. No, they go for bandwagoning. There is a concept of bandwagoning that we have to understand. And then he said that there is also a concept of buck passing rather than balancing. Right? We'll see what is this bandwagoning and buck passing. So bandwagoning means appeasement. Right? You are appeasing the other state and joining the league. If USA has hegemonic power and China is trying to have hegemony, as thought by Kenneth Walls, that they are going to face counter coalitions, but they are not going to have coalitions because there are certain states in and around China who thinks that okay, by aligning with China we can have more benefit rather than by aligning with USA. This alignment is called bandwagoning. Pakistan may align with China, Philippines may align with China, Brunei may align with China, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, any state can go and align with China because they think that their security will be more secured by going with China rather than by going with USA. Rather than form counter coalition to China, they are bandwagoning to China. So this is first point, which he says that don't think that always there is going to be counter coalitions, they are going to be bandwagons. Right? This is first thing, bandwagoning, which means appeasing or joining the League of China. If you look at China's rise, One Belt and One Road initiative, why every country is going and joining, even though they know that China is going to exercise their economic hegemony through One Road and One Belt initiative, because their interests are more secured when they join this league. That is why they are very sure that that shows that bandwagoning is present in the international relations, right? So this is one thing. At the same time, what about the USA? Is USA is going to counter always China? No, USA don't go for direct attack on China. Reason is, why should I go for a waging war on China, which is geographically very, very far away from my state, and waging a war directly on China increases my military expenditure, economic expenditure, and everything. Why should I go? Why should I go for direct confrontation? Why can't I pass the ball to other court which is near to China, such as India? Let me pass the ball to India, which is a swing state, which means this state can be used to counter China rather than America directly countering China. This is called buck passing. So hegemons, already existing hegemons, will go for buck passing rather than going for balancing directly. This was Mearsheimer said. So don't think that it is always going to be counterproductive for two reasons. One is there is concept of bandwagoning and there is concept of buck passing. Right? This is what John Mayer says and says that counterproductive, it is not counterproductive. Right? Let's move. Continuing with the same discussion. Small countries will prefer bandwagoning because they go with the band. That is, what is whether USA is more favoring them or China is more favoring them. So small countries always go for bandwagoning. So there is no counter coalitions as such. And hegemon like USA prefers to pass the buck rather than balancing, right? Why? Why USA doesn't go for direct balancing China and passes its ball to India? Because there was one thinker called Mancur Olson. He has written a book called The Logic of Collective Action. If you want to have collective actions, then there is certain logic. In his book, he says that what is the logic which he says? In his book, Mancur Olson says there is a paradox of collective actions. There exists some paradox in collective actions. What is that paradox? The paradox of collective actions is no collective action is actually collective. No collective action is actually collective. What do this mean? What do I mean by this? What do Mancur Olson mean by this? The paradox in collective actions is, though it appears that every state is joining counter alliances or collective actions, but every state join to have collective action only if they have something to take away for them. So individual interest is what it drives for collective action. So the paradox is no collective action is actually collective. Every collective action is based on the individual benefits. What is I am going to get from this collective action? If I want to go and enter into this collective action, what is the benefit that I am going to get? So this is the first thing that people or the states think before going and joining into any collective actions. He has explained this beautifully in his book called The Logic of Collective Action. So he said that the paradox of collective action is that no collective action is actually collective, rather every collective action is based on the individual benefits. So USA, see, a hegemon which is always present, already present, they don't go for balancing because balancing requires collective action. If it wants to counter China, it has to form counter collective actions. Collective action has to be done. That is, it has to take into India into consideration, or the countries which have equal ideology like USA form a collective team, and then it has to balance. Why to take this measure? Because USA doesn't prefer this, because USA's benefit is very 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 less in that way. Because so until and unless hegemon sees any real aim in balancing, it will not go for balancing directly. USA doesn't go for balancing directly because it costs China. If it is going to wage a war directly on China in order to counterbalance this, then definitely it is going to increase the military cost. It is going to increase its defense costs, and it is going to have huge impact on USA directly. Why should you go for this measure when there is another alternative measure which is present? You go and make India pass the ball to India so that India goes to fight with China, or India goes to have this balancing with China. Why should USA directly involve in China when there is one cheap alternative which is available, like instigating India and making a war between India and China, and then I can be very safe. This is called buck passing. What USA doing here is buck passing, right? This is what the thing is. So until and unless hegemon sees real aim in balancing, it will not go for balancing directly. Meir Shimmer also suggests that existing hegemon will prefer buck passing, especially when there is a situation of multipolarity. When there is multipolarity, existing states or existing hegemon will not go for directly balancing. Say, for example, if there is multipolar world where India is a power, China is a power, Russia is a power, Japan is a power, USA is a power. If there is multipolarity, USA will never enter into balancing directly. Rather, it always tries to go for buck passing. Why buck passing? It is more cost effective and it is more easier to pass this. And as this is multipolar, means every pole has equal strengths or maximum more or less the same strength. So India can counter. When India can counter China, why should USA involve directly? So what he says is, John Maynard Keynes says, in the existing hegemon will prefer buck passing, especially when the situation is multipolar. So when the situation is multipolar, they go for buck passing. Buck passing is cheaper and more effective, right? So what are the strategies that are available for buck passing? One is bait and bleed. Another one is bloodletting. What is this bait and bleed? We all know what is bait. In Telugu, we call it as era. Bait means in order to catch fish, you go with a bait, right? ఎరేయాలి చేపలు పట్టాలంటే అనేసి. So what is that bait? The hegemon, like USA, what says that it gives one bait to a state called India. It gives something to India in the form of civil nuclear treaty, and it says, okay, USA says, India, you are very, very, very powerful now. You go and you can counter China. So this is the bait. By saying that, okay, you are superpower, you can counter China, you are rising, you have nuclear power now, your state is rising, your economy is rising. So by inviting your leaders, say for example, if Trump is inviting Narendra Modi, it is just a bait to use India in order to get their advantage of buck passing, right? So one strategy is bait and bleed. What is this bait and bleed? You give bait and then ask that country to go and attack. That is giving something, and that is building overconfidence in the swing states like India, and then asking it to go and fight. When these two are fighting, India and USA, they will be bleeding, right? Rather than directly involving. So major powers will do this way. Great powers will do this way. Or bloodletting. What is this bloodletting? Ensure that the conflict which is already started continues forever. If India enters into any disagreements with China, or enters into any mutual disputes with China, then it has to ensure that their dispute continues forever, because and blood will be losing of the both countries. Both countries' blood will be losing. As a result, China, USA can continue its hegemonic power, right? This is what it says. So, what is the point? That here, the existing hegemon, such as USA, always tries to maintain its hegemonic power. The first thing is it tries to maintain its hegemony. At the same time, it doesn't want other countries' rise of other countries. So it has to ensure both things. One is its hegemony is maintained. The other one is the existing does not want the rise of other countries. Either it may be Russia, it may be China, it may be Japan, it may be Iran, it may be Israel, or it may be India, or it may be Pakistan. The existing hegemon doesn't want the rise of any other country. Right? How can it ensure that it is not going to rise? Through buck passing. The buck will be passed through bait and bleed or through bloodletting. These are the principles which are available. So John Mearsheimer is telling, unlike Kenneth Ward has thought that whenever a state is going to have hegemonic power or preponderance power, he thought that counter coalitions will be formed and it is going to be counterproductive. What Mearsheimer says is always there is no chance for counter coalition, because some small states may bandwagon with the rising power, and at the same time the existing hegemon may pass the buck rather than directly balancing the rising power, right? How it balances? Rather than balancing, it passes the buck through bait and bleed method, through bloodletting method. Now, when these two options are available, there is no such thing called counterproductive, right? So this way he proves that Kenneth Walls' theory of counterproductive is not sustained, right? Let us look at the practical example of what we have discussed so far. See, if USA and China, USA is already a hegemon. If China wants to counter USA, then automatically it will be going on its maximizing its power, right? USA is a hegemon, existing hegemon, right? It has its power up to this level, and China, which is at this level, tries to maximize its power up to this. And whenever China is rising, India, whose power is very less compared to China, tries to achieve this, right? Because every state has one goal, that is security maximization. Sorry, security is the ultimate goal of their national interest. Security of the nation is the ultimate interest. So India is going to counter China. China is going to counter India. So this is how the system is present. All states have only one goal. There is no functional differentiation between the states. Every state has one goal, that is security of their nations. However, the difference exists in the capacities of the respective nations. So they will be always trying to enhance their capacities. So whenever China is trying to rise and become hegemon or replace USA, automatically USA comes with a doctrine of buck pass through the scheme called Asia's pivot policy. This Asia's pivot policy, later renamed as policy Asia's rebalancing. Through this policy, it supports some Asian countries like India and says, okay, it gives military support, strategic alliances, it makes nuclear deals with the country, it makes strategic alliances, and then it increases its power so that it can counter China rather than China countering USA. So this is the basic theme. China is expanding its power. USA counters this by balancing with China through Asia pivot policy. If you look at Asia pivot policy or Asia's rebalancing, this is the main aim of USA. And US-India strategic partnership is one goal where it is ensuring or passing the buck. But if India is unable to balance its power with China, automatically USA has to think other alternative where it can go and balance with China, because USA is observing that China is rising to such an extent that today India is no match to China economically or leadership wise or politically or socially. China is rising to a very large extent. So China's power is widening very large, and the gap between the powers of India and China is very high, is very large. As a result, USA has to counter this. When your buck passing is not working, go with another strategy or go with a strategy called Quad, where you will form balancing by bringing together the countries whose ideology is similar to our ideology. So US adapted the policy of Quad as India's buck passing is not working. Right? So this is the thing. But USA, the gap between India and China is widening. USA adapted the Quad under Trump. So what do John Mearsheimer mean? John Mearsheimer simply means that unlike Kenneth Walls, who thought that if a state is going to be hegemon or going to have preponderance power, the other states are going to form counter alliances and it is going to be counterproductive. John Mearsheimer proves that it is very wrong, because there is other things or other methods like bandwagoning the rising states or buck passing by the existing state, existing hegemonic power. If buck passing doesn't work, then in that case, states go for balancing. If buck passing is not working, if India is not going to balance USA, then balance China, or obviously USA has to look at balancing China through other means. How it balances? It enters into the deal of Quad. So Quad is the balancing. So balancing as such is the last option for the existing hegemon. Last option for the existing hegemon. Last option for the existing hegemon to counter the rising powers. Right? This is what John Mearsheimer said. So don't think that every time it is going to be balancing. It is going to have buck passing methods. If buck passing doesn't work, then as an alternative way or as a final way, they go for balancing. This is one thing that we have to understand. So through this example, what it says, China's rise will not be peaceful because China's goal is similar to German's Hitler or France Napoleon's, that is power maximization. So its rise will not be peaceful. So the tragedy of the great power politics is that it is going to have war. Trade war is one example, or trade war is one outcome of this tragedy of great power politics. The war that exists in Afghanistan between USA and China, or between Myanmar, the war that exists in some states like Iran, Myanmar, Afghanistan. So these are some examples which shows that yes, even though they are nuclear powers, war is inevitable. And how this war is going to be, maybe conventional war, maybe they are not going to directly participate, but through proxies they are going to wage the war. So war is a reality in international relations. So, US will prefer buck passing so long as it feels that India is a possible state. As long as India can counter China, USA will always be feeding India with its support. But if the gap between USA, India, and China is increasing very much, then automatically USA goes for balancing as the last option. So this is what defensive realist said. Offensive realist said. So this is the difference. This is a practical example on how John Mayer proves his point. That is in his book called The Great Power Politics. John Mearsheimer proves his point. The book as such is The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, right? Tragedy of Great Power Politics, written in the year 2001. So what is that tragedy? Ultimately, it is going to be the war. How the war? It may not be nuclear war because mutually assured destruction, as there is one concept called MAD, mutually assured destruction. They may not go for nuclear wars, but there are conventional wars such as the trade wars which was happening between USA and China, and the proxy wars that are happening in Myanmar, which are happening in Iran or in Afghanistan. So this is the ultimate thing. So the states has to maximize its power at any cost because war is going to be the ultimate thing. So this is how Mearsheimer proves his point very, very beautifully and counters the defensive realist who says that you should have minimum power, right? But John Mearsheimer says no, minimum power cannot ensure your security because offense is the best defense always. I think you understood the point. So far what I discussed how the theory of neorealism has evolved and what are the basic features of neorealism and from what point neorealism has two schools, that is offensive schools and defensive schools. Who is the propounder of defensive school? I discussed Kenneth Waltz is the propounder of defensive realist, and whereas John Mearsheimer is the propounder of offensive realist. And as far as the difference between these schools, the difference goes not at the points of understanding the international politics, but at the concept of power, how much power each should have. So, at the point of power, again I am repeating this, at the point of power, they differ. Some say the defensive realist says that you should have minimum power to balance. But the offensive realist says you should have hegemonic power or preponderance power, right? Because offense is the best defense. So this is the point on which this is the difference between the power that should be between the power that one has to pass is the difference between the defensive realism and offensive realism. And then he also proves, Mearsheimer also proves that whenever countries are going for hegemonic power, there is no need that to think that it is going to be counterproductive because it is not going to result in counter coalitions always. Because this man has said if it is going to be hegemonic power, then the difference is or the difficulty is they are going to have counterproductive. This man said that it is going to be counterproductive if they are going for hegemonic power because counter coalitions are going to be formed. But John Mearsheimer proves this point as wrong by saying that it is not counter coalitions are not always a phenomena. Rather than counter coalitions, there is one concept called bandwagoning and buck passing. If buck passing doesn't work, then they go for balancing. So this is the difference between John Mearsheimer's defensive realism, Kenneth Waltz's offensive realism. I think you have understood the two classes or the two schools in neorealism, that is offensive realism and defensive realism. Now we will see the criticisms that exist in neorealism. The criticisms of neorealist school is that is made by there is one more school which is called neoclassical realism. The propounders of this neoclassical realist school are Fareed Zakaria and Randall Schweller. These are neoclassical realists. Fareed Zakaria, Randall Schweller. What is their intention is, or what is their criticism is, they criticized the neorealists saying that these people have not given scope for actors. They didn't consider the human nature. But human nature, though, to some extent, it is going to influence international politics. That is what their goal. But these persons, they neglected totally the human nature. If it is Mr. Nehru who is at the helm of affairs, then states will be behaving in one way. If it is Mr. Modi, states will be differing in another way. So, more or less, human nature will have certain impact on the international politics, which was totally neglected by the so-called neoliberals in their structural realism. So, this was the first thing which was criticized, or the first point which was criticized by neoclassical realists towards neorealists. And the second point is they have not given any scope for foreign policy actions. So foreign policy also determines the international politics. How? Say for example, if India is having no first use policy, then automatically it will have certain impact on international politics, right? So foreign policy has to be taken into consideration. At the same time, scope for actors has to be given in the international politics. This was the criticism of neoclassical realism. So from this onwards, there is one more school which emerges, which is called the neoclassical realism. So far, what we discussed, liberal school, and then there is one more school called realist school. In realist school, we have seen classical realism, and then neorealism or contemporary realism. In the neorealist school, again, what we have seen two differences. One is the defensive realism, and one is the offensive realism. And the defensive realism is Kenneth Waltz, offensive realism is John Mearsheimer. And then there is a criticism on both these neorealist schools by the so-called neo-classical realists. Who are those neoclassical realists? Rand and Schweller as well as Fareed Zakaria. So in the next class, we are going to see this school. Though it is not much important for Union Public Service Commission examination, neoclassical realism, we have to understand this in order to apply that in paper 2 of international politics. I think so far it is very clear. This is the schools of international relations on which they have evolved. So far we discussed this right from the beginning. The liberal school, realist school, classical realism, neo-realism, defensive realism, offensive realism, and then neoclassical realism. So far this is what we discussed. In the next class, we will be coming with a new topic called neoclassical realism. Just we will give a passing remark in order to understand how the states are functioning in neoclassical realism. So this is what I wanted to tell. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. You can be following me. You can, if you want, you can subscribe to my channel, because I am going to make free videos as far as the entire topic of PSIR is concerned. I want to share my knowledge so far I have in my preparation. So this will be one of the most important things. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Have a nice day.